The heat of the Mexican night weighed heavily on the small OXXO store located on a deserted city street. The doorbell rang as three hooded men rushed in, pointing their weapons at the employees and customers present. The plan seemed simple: take all the cash from the register and the merchandise, intimidating everyone with the usual violence of a robbery. Among the few customers in the store, two men seemed completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding around them. One of them, middle-aged and with a deep scar on his cheek, stood quietly, observing intently. The other, younger, a little taller, but with an equally imposing posture, calmly watched the movement of the doors and the thieves. When the group's leader, a thin man in dirty clothes, approached the cashier, he looked at the two customers suspiciously, but said nothing. He was focused on the heist. He knew time was against them. The customers, however, were not what they seemed. The middle-aged man with the scar exchanged a quick glance with the young man, a silent signal that went unnoticed by the thieves. It was a code, a warning. Both were part of something much bigger, much more dangerous. One was a hitman, and the other a trusted informant. They were not ordinary civilians, but key pieces in a power game that was beginning to unfold at that moment. The silence inside the store was broken only by the shouts of the robbers. The tension was palpable. The young man, with an agile movement, stood up and, without taking his eyes off the criminals, signaled to the other. The man with the scar slowly stood up, making no sound, but with a discreet smile on his lips. They were ready. The situation was about to get out of control. OXXO was a reflection of everyday life in Mexico, bustling, simple, yet essential. While the thieves focused on the cash registers and shelves, the city scene around them never stopped. Cars sped past on the concrete street, and the distant sound of a band's music signaled the approach of a party in the square. However, inside the store, the situation was completely different. The two men who stood out among the clients were well-known figures in the city's most dangerous circles, but their personal lives were a stark contrast to the image of violence they projected. The middle-aged man with the scar was known as El Chacal, and his reputation preceded him. For years, he had been a feared shadow in the criminal underworld, but few knew his true nature. The scar on his face was a reminder of a turbulent past, when he had to escape an ambush that nearly cost him his life. Since then, he had become immune to physical and emotional pain, as if nothing else could touch him. His partner, the young man with the tense posture, was known only as El Águila, the eagle. With piercing eyes and an impassive expression, he was part of one of the most powerful groups in Mexico, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. His loyalty was unquestionable, but his approach to the job was meticulous and calculating, always thinking about his next move before acting. He was there, in that store, not only as a member of the cartel, but also as someone who possessed an implacable code of honor. As the robbers advanced, the group of criminals inside the store didn't perceive the growing danger around them. They were used to robbing small establishments like that one, where the chance of finding anything of value was minimal. But there was something about the two silent men that didn't fit. El Águila's cold gaze wasn't the gaze of a simple customer. The younger robber, still nervous, approached the cashier and yelled at the employee, demanding all the money. The woman behind the counter, visibly frightened, tried to obey, but her hands trembled as she counted the money. "Quick, now!" the robber shouted, slamming the gun on the counter. Mexico, with its deep roots in fear and respect for figures of power, was fertile ground for the organized crime empire. The CJNG, led by a mysterious figure, had grown enormously in recent years, controlling not only trafficking routes, but also influencing local politics and even small towns. El Chacal and El Águila were key players in this system, but what the world didn't know was the subtle game being played between them and the cartel. OXXO, though small, was merely the setting for a much larger confrontation. Tension was rising in the store, The thieves were about to grab what they wanted and flee, but the glances exchanged between El Chacal and El Águila indicated that something was about to change. No move was being made randomly. It was more than a simple robbery. It was a trap. They knew that at any moment the CJNG could act, and the consequences for the criminals would be inevitable. El Chacal had a past marked by difficult choices, and his name was feared throughout the state. He wasn't just a hitman, he was a legend. But his past wasn't something he liked to revisit. That night, his thoughts were far from violence. He thought of his daughter, who lived in another state. He no longer saw himself as a man of war. It was a pity that fate had other plans for him. The robbers, seemingly inexperienced in dealing with people who weren't easily intimidated, began to feel uncomfortable with the two men's unwavering silence. The leader, an older criminal with a hoarse and impatient voice, pointed his gun at El Chacal and with a forced smile shouted, "Get up, old man. Let's see if you've got anything worthwhile." El Chacal remained calm. What he saw before him was not just desperate thieves, but an opportunity. He knew the city was full of unseen forces operating in the shadows. This robbery was, in fact, an attempt to steal something much bigger than simple money. El Águila watched, motionless, his eyes seeming to see beyond the thieves, beyond the store. He wasn't there merely as a spectator. He knew that the criminals who had invaded OXXO weren't part of the bigger plan. They were playing with the wrong pieces. The cartel had its own methods, and anyone who dared to disregard them would face immediate and devastating consequences. The leader of the robbery, nervous about the delay in the cashier's orders, quickly advanced towards El Chacal, and in an unexpected movement pressed the gun against the man's face. The tension reached its peak. "Now you're going to pay, you old son of a—" Before he could finish the sentence, El Chacal made a swift movement, grabbing the weapon with one hand and with the other pressing a metallic object against the assailant's neck. The silence was broken by a muffled sound, a quick blow, and the older assailant fell unconscious to the ground. The scene was quick, almost rehearsed. The other robbers didn't understand what had happened until the youngest of them, visibly nervous, looked at El Águila. With an impassive expression, he made a movement with his head, as if signaling that it was time to take control. The young robber, still hesitant, raised his weapon, but El Águila was no longer watching. He advanced with the speed of a predator. In a single fluid movement, he disarmed the criminal and shoved him against the liquor shelf, where he collided with a case of beer. The jolt caused bottles to spill, creating a visual spectacle of chaos, while the assailant lay immobilized. "You don't know who we are," said El Águila, his voice calm and controlled, but with a tone that made anyone doubt their own sanity. "Now, you're going to listen to us." Meanwhile, the leader of the robbery was still lying on the ground, unconscious. The other criminals, terrified by how quickly the two customers had neutralized the attack, began to look at each other with dread. What had seemed like a simple robbery was now turning into something no one could have predicted. The other OXXO patrons, who had been silently observing the unfolding situation, began to realize that there was more to it than just a simple robbery that night. The tension was palpable. But meanwhile, El Chacal seemed more focused on another problem, the presence of a third man approaching the store. He recognized him immediately. He was a cartel informant who, realizing what was happening, was trying to escape before things got out of control. El Chacal turned to El Águila and with a simple gesture indicated that the informant should be detained. "We can't let this get away," he said firmly. "We have to make sure the cartel knows the message has been delivered." The real conflict was only beginning. The simple robbery had turned into a power struggle. Now everyone was at stake, the thieves, the customers, and the cartel itself. Amidst the chaos, a new question arose. How far would El Chacal and El Aguila go to ensure that control remained in the right hands? The situation inside the OXXO continued to unfold, with the remaining robbers finding themselves increasingly cornered. But the real danger to them didn't just come from El Chacal and El Aguila. There was something else at stake, something they couldn't see, but which was about to change everything. What seemed to be a controlled, calculated action was becoming a silent war, fought behind the scenes. While El Chacal and El Aguila visibly maintained control of the situation, the relationships between the characters began to intensify. The younger robber, who had tried to fight back against El Aguila, now trembled, feeling the pressure of a situation spiraling out of control. What he didn't know was that among the criminals present, there was a network of traitors, people who were about to be exposed, their loyalties questioned. The moment El Chacal noticed the informant trying to leave through the back door, he felt a chill. That man wasn't just a simple messenger. He had something more to offer, something crucial to the success of the cartel's operation at that moment. "You think you can get away with it, don't you?" El Chacal shouted, his voice sharp and authoritative. The informant, hearing this, stopped immediately. He knew that if captured, the punishment would be brutal, but his escape was no longer in his hands. The true test of loyalty was about to begin. "You betrayed the cartel," said El Chacal, approaching him slowly, his gaze implacable. "And now, what do you have to say about that?" The informant, pale and desperate, swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The weight of his betrayal was more evident than ever, and he knew that death was a real possibility. He couldn't escape, but his life was still in his hands, depending on his words. He had information that could alter the course of the cartel's operation, something crucial that he had discovered before trying to flee. "They were after the shipment. They were waiting for it," he murmured, not daring to look El Chacal in the eye. It turns out the OXXO was just a meeting point. The real target was something else. While El Chacal conducted his interrogation, El Aguila continued to monitor the other robbers, his patience beginning to wear thin. Every passing second was an opportunity for something to go wrong. The thieves were no longer just trying to escape, but were about to be completely dismantled. And El Aguila knew that, as the game dragged on, the consequences would be even more severe for everyone involved. The pressure on the criminals was intensifying, and one of them, the oldest of the group, was beginning to show signs of panic. He, who had previously appeared so confident, was now trembling, looking around with the feeling that the world was closing in on him. "We have to get out of here, now!" he shouted, his voice filled with fear. But El Chacal merely smiled, his gaze colder than ever. "You're not in a position to give orders, my friend. Now, you're going to tell us everything you know, and then we'll decide what to do." The informant, his gaze fixed on the ground, continued. "They were trying to raid the cartel's warehouses on the outskirts near the main road. If they managed to seize the shipment, it would be the end for all of us. And you're just pawns in all of this." The revelation sent a shockwave through El Chacal. The cartel's operation was compromised, and that store, the simple OXXO, was just a minor piece in a much larger game. The tension intensified even further, but one thing was clear. Those men were not just common robbers, they were pawns. Yes, but pawns on a war chessboard involving forces that no one could control. "Now I understand everything," El Chacal said, his voice cold as a sharp blade. "This will change everything." The clock on the wall of OXXO kept precise time, but time seemed to have slowed down inside. The tension was unbearable, and the smell of fear hung in the air. The small shop, which had once seemed like an ordinary place, was now the stage for a silent battle between life and death. What no one expected, however, happened when the informant began to speak, revealing more than they could have imagined. In an instant, the true reason for the robbery came to light, and everything that El Chacal and El Aguila thought they knew about the game was about to change. The big move, the cartel's true plan, was closer than they imagined, and the last piece, hidden until that moment, was about to be set in motion. As El Chacal fixed his gaze on the informant, a series of gunshots rang out from outside the store. Abruptly, the reality they knew was turned upside down. It was the sound of an attack. A coordinated attack, and the enemies they thought they had under control were now poised to take them down. Without anyone noticing, a group of CJNG hitmen had surrounded the OXXO. They weren't there for a simple heist. They were there to carry out orders. The cartel's original plan involved an exchange of information, but what El Chacal and El Águila didn't know was that the true objective of the operation was to eliminate any traitor within the organization. The leader of the hitman group entered through the back door, his expression hard and without remorse. He looked at El Chacal, observing the chaos in the store, and his gaze was direct. "You shouldn't have done that," he said coldly, and with a quick gesture pointed to the informant, who was already tied to the floor. The gesture was clear. El Chacal and El Águila had done what they shouldn't have, interfered too much in the cartel's internal operations. The informant, who had been useful up to that point, was now being discarded like a pawn. He was about to be executed, but not before one last revelation. "You think you're in control, don't you?" the informant stammered, a nervous smile on his face. "But they were watching me the whole time. You don't know who the real enemy is." The revelation caught El Águila by surprise. He looked at El Chacal, his eyes hardening. What the informant had said was no empty threat. Something was wrong. Something was happening in the shadows of the cartel. The direction of the game was changing, and they were only beginning to understand the pieces of the puzzle. Tension rose within the walls of the OXXO as a second group of hitmen, better equipped and even more organized, entered through the main entrance. Lights flickered, and the sound of boots on the floor echoed, marking the arrival of reinforcements. "Now, you're all going to pay," said the leader of the hitmen, as his men took up positions inside the store. The atmosphere was one of imminent death, but something in El Chacal and El Águila had changed. They were no longer in total control, but they were still ready to fight back. With the sound of gunfire and the chaos intensifying, El Chacal and El Águila realized that the original heist had turned into something much bigger. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were trying to keep the cartel united against an internal threat that threatened to destroy everything they had built. They now had a choice: either confront the hitmen and continue trying to dismantle the enemy from within, or flee to fight another battle. The cartel leader, the true enemy, was out there. But it wasn't just a power struggle. The war now was for loyalty, and whoever survived the night would emerge with the key to the cartel's future. El Chacal and El Águila exchanged glances, both sharing the same thought. Loyalty, now more than ever, would be the greatest bargaining chip. But the real question was, how far would they be willing to go to maintain control of everything? The sound of gunfire still reverberated off the walls of the OXXO, and the tension was palpable. The plan that El Chacal and El Águila had devised was now unraveling piece by piece under the pressure of the cartel's hitmen who had arrived to deliver the final blow. The informant, who until then had been a source of information, was now just another victim in the game. El Chacal looked around, his eyes sharpening his perception of everything that was happening. Every movement of the hitmen was an imminent threat. The cartel leader, who until then had been behind the curtain, now appeared more real and more dangerous than ever. The revelation that the true enemy was within the cartel itself left everyone bewildered. But there was no time for doubt. The consequences of that moment would reverberate for a long time. The informant, now crouched on the ground, felt the weight of what he had done. His actions were no longer his own. They were tied to a collective destiny, and his role in history was coming to an end. The leader of the Hitmen signaled to one of his men, who approached and with a swift movement shot the informant. The execution was quick, but it left a trail of impunity. He would no longer be a problem, but what remained was a mess difficult to clean up. Meanwhile, El Chacal and El Águila were determined to take control of the situation. What had previously seemed like a simple surveillance operation had turned into a silent war, where alliances had weakened and loyalties were questionable. The leader of the Hitmen, now in complete control of the situation, looked directly at El Chacal. There was something in the man's eyes, a silent familiarity, as if they already knew each other. He knew El Chacal by reputation, but this was different. There was more at stake than simple internal disputes. "You should have understood by now, El Chacal," the leader said, his voice as cold as ice. "Loyalty has a price, and you just failed at the most important part." "I didn't fail," El Chacal replied, his voice low but full of implied power. "You're the one playing with the wrong cards." He made a quick movement, his arm reaching out to grab the revolver he had left on the counter. But before he could act, El Águila was in front of him, his hand raised in a gesture of caution. "What are you doing?" El Águila asked, with the calmness that always characterized him. He knew that acting impulsively now would be a fatal mistake. "I'm just checking if they know what they're really up against," El Chacal murmured, his eyes still fixed on the leader of the Hitmen. The battle to maintain control of the cartel was far from over. The Hitmen, for their part, were aware that the internal war could not continue much longer. The cartel was on the verge of collapse, and anyone caught in the middle of this power struggle could be wiped out without warning. Threats, however firm, were far from guaranteeing victory. "You still think you can control this?" the leader of the Hitmen scoffed. "Your time is running out." But it was at that moment, as the confrontation between the two sides intensified, that El Chacal did something unexpected. With impressive speed, he made a silent signal to El Águila, and together, without exchanging words, they made a decision. The only way to resolve the situation would be to directly attack the leadership of the Hitmen without hesitation. It was now or never. "Prepare yourselves," El Chacal said, his eyes finally narrowing with determination. "This is the end for them." In a coordinated and precise move, El Chacal and El Águila attacked, the Hitmen never having a chance to react. The first shot fired was from El Chacal's side, hitting one of the Hitmen in the leg. Chaos quickly ensued, with shots being exchanged and the store filled with the sounds of war. The fight was quick, but bloody. In the end, only the two main hitmen were left standing, and both fell quickly under the pressure of the relentless hands of El Chacal and El Águila. But something had changed in the dynamic. They knew that the cartel would not be the same after that night, and the weight of the choices made there would still echo in the shadows of the criminal underworld. Night dragged on in the shop, but silence finally took over. El Chacal and El Águila were now in the middle of a miniature battlefield. The fallen henchmen were witnesses to a power they hadn't anticipated, but while the end seemed near for those who had opposed them, for El Chacal and El Águila, the game was only just beginning. The consequences of everything that had happened inside OXXO were still far from being fully understood. The cartel, as always, moved in the shadows, and now the two men found themselves facing a new reality. They were no longer just hitmen. They were, in fact, at the center of a conflict of greater proportions than they could have imagined. The cartel was at risk of imploding under the pressure of its own betrayals, and El Chacal knew he had made a crucial decision, something that would change his life forever. "I don't know if we can do this," El Águila said, his voice calm, but with a hint of doubt. He stood beside El Chacal, observing the devastation around them. The fight had been hard, but the real battle was yet to come. "Do what?" El Chacal replied with a serious expression, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Now is when we begin to understand what the cartel really means. El Aguila looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. The issue was no longer just about power, it was about their future, about how to survive in the chaos they were creating. They had defeated the thugs who tried to take control, but the real enemy was yet to come. And for that, they needed to change. For El Shakal, that night wasn't just a reflection of his leadership skills or his combat experience, it was something deeper. He had begun to question what it truly meant to be part of the cartel. His loyalty to the cartel had always been unquestionable, but now he saw that things were changing. What he once considered a solid empire was cracking. The loyalty he had to the cartel was no longer there. He realized that true loyalty was no longer about serving the organization, but about protecting those who still mattered. His family, his friends, and ultimately, his own humanity. We can no longer be just killing machines, El Aguila. The war we are fighting now is different, El Shakal said with conviction. We need something bigger. We need a change. Those words were laden with profound transformation. El Shakal had begun to realize that the cartel's future no longer depended on brute force, but on strategic control and carefully crafted alliances. He could no longer rely on the old methods of acting alone. Loyalty, intelligence, and adaptation were now his most powerful weapons. On the other hand, El Aguila was also changing. He had always been calmer and more calculating, but the tension of fighting against his own cartel was beginning to weigh on him. He knew that El Shakal was right, but the fear of the unknown still haunted him. He had always been a tool in the power game, but now he too was beginning to question what the price would be for his involvement. Do you really think change will happen? Do you think the cartel will let us live to see it? El Aguila asked, with a hint of doubt in his voice. I think our only chance is to live, El Aguila, El Shakal replied, finally allowing himself to relax a little. Change won't come easily, but if our loyalty to the cartel is just a reflection of fear, then we'll never get out of this. There was something refreshing in El Shakal's words. What had previously seemed like an endless game of survival was now transforming into a fight for change, a fight for autonomy. They both knew they were on the verge of a new era. The internal struggle they had waged was not merely a physical battle. It was a fight for the soul of the cartel, for the reconstruction of an empire torn apart by betrayals and internal divisions. At the end of that chaotic night, El Shakal and El Aguila were ready to take control. No longer as mere soldiers, but as leaders with a clearer vision of the future. They needed to plan their next move more intelligently, with more patience. The future they sought would not be built on brute force, but on the right alliances and strategic decisions. And for that, they would need to grow even more. As the sun began to rise and the OXXO fell silent, El Shakal knew that the first step toward true change had been taken. The war was far from over, but he now had a vision of a new path. The situation within the cartel had transformed into a game of chess, where every move was crucial for survival. El Shakal and El Aguila were now strategically positioned, aware that the cartel's future depended on their actions in the coming days. The tension between the cartel's internal factions was about to reach a breaking point, and both knew that the only way to emerge victorious was to anticipate the enemy's move. After the chaotic night at OXXO, where they had overcome the Hitmen's attack, they had made a crucial discovery. There were traitors within their own ranks, people who were plotting to overthrow the cartel's leadership. This was confirmed by information from internal sources and by the presence of unexpected allies who had secretly approached them. The atmosphere was heavy and betrayal hung in the air. El Shakal was now focused almost obsessively on planning their next steps. The revelation that there were more than just mercenaries involved in the attempted coup led them to a new understanding of who the real enemies were. And the greatest threat wasn't just the hitmen and rival cartel members, it was within the cartel's own ranks, the men who had been their allies for so long. "It's now or never," El Chacal told El Aguila, their eyes fixed on the map spread out before them. They had analyzed the cartel's weaknesses, the flaws that could be exploited to turn the situation in their favor. With the new information in hand, El Chacal and El Aguila began tracking down the traitors. The search was meticulous, like a treasure hunt, but with a deadly price. Every step they took, every move they made, could be their last. Time was against them. The leader of the cartel that challenged them knew that the pressure was mounting, and the only way to maintain control would be to act quickly before the cartel's foundations completely crumbled. "We have to act fast, before it spreads further," El Aguila commented, his voice cold and calculating. He knew that once the truth about the betrayal got out, the fight for leadership of the cartel would become even more difficult. But El Chacal's actions demonstrated that he was determined not to lose the war. The tension surrounding the hunt for traitors was palpable. Every man who approached El Chacal and El Aguila could be an enemy. Every ally could be hiding something. The trust that was once unquestionable was now under intense testing. While the investigations continued, El Chacal received an unexpected visit. In the darkness of the night, an old ally appeared. El Tigre, as he was known, was one of the cartel's leaders who, after the death of his family in a previous conflict, had retreated into the background. Now he wanted to meet with El Chacal and El Aguila to discuss a new alliance. "I know where the real traitor is," El Tigre said with a serious expression. "And I know what the cartel is planning to do with you two, but you need to act fast. From now on, your time is running out." With those words, the situation intensified even further. Now, El Chacal and El Aguila were not only facing internal traitors, but a war for the very survival of the cartel. The tension was reaching its peak, and the stakes had never been higher. They needed to act fast, or all the control they had tried to maintain over the cartel would be lost. The reactions to each discovery led them into a race against time, where every action became more urgent. The final plan was taking shape before them, and the confrontation with the traitors was inevitable. The doubt that had previously hung over El Chacal's choices now turned into certainty. The fight for leadership of the cartel would not be merely a matter of brute force. It would require intelligence, strategy, and above all, the courage to take risks. "Now we'll see who's really on our side," El Chacal stated with conviction, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Nothing will ever be the same again, and whoever is against us will pay." The next move was about to be made, and the only certainty was that the cartel's future would be decided in the next move. The night was tense, the atmosphere heavy with the promise of a confrontation that would change everything. El Chacal and El Aguila had joined forces, meticulously aligning their pieces like two masters playing chess. But unlike a common game, this war would not be resolved with a single move. The cartel was divided, and the fight for leadership would reach its climax that night. The hideout where they were, an old mansion on the outskirts of the city, was about to become the scene of a conflict that would define not only the future of the cartel, but also the very survival of El Chacal and El Aguila. They had discovered that the real enemy was closer than they imagined, a former ally, the right-hand man of the cartel leader, who was orchestrating the attacks and manipulating the situation to his advantage. Now, he was about to be confronted. El Chacal and El Aguila were ready to deliver the final blow. There was no more room for doubt. The leader of the treacherous hitmen, El Toro, had been captured, and his loyalty was being questioned by everyone. He was the last obstacle to total control of the cartel, and El Chacal knew that the only way to secure their future was to eliminate the source of betrayal once and for all. The confrontation began with a burst of gunfire. The house was overrun by a horde of hitmen, all armed to the teeth, ready to defend El Toro. But El Chacal and El Águila were already prepared. The battle was swift and bloody. El Chacal didn't hesitate. Every shot fired was calculated, precise. He was determined to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The fight intensified as El Toro's henchmen began to lose ground. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mansion walls, mixed with shouts and battle orders. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. El Toro was hit by a shot, but he didn't fall immediately. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, and before anyone could react, he shot El Águila. The impact was devastating. El Águila fell, blood splattering across the ground. El Chacal reacted immediately, rushing towards his companion. Rage consumed him, but he knew the plan had to continue. He lunged at El Toro with a ferocity he had never known he possessed. The confrontation between the two was brutal. El Toro was desperate, trying to hold his ground, but El Chacal was relentless. The man who had been the cartel's right-hand man was now being brought down by the one who had once been his subordinate. With one last move, El Chacal caught El Toro by surprise, plunging the knife that had been left by one of the hitmen into him. The blade penetrated forcefully, and El Toro fell to the ground, defeated. The room was silent, except for the panting sound of El Chacal, who looked at his enemy's body with an expression of pure determination. But while El Toro's body lay on the ground, El Chacal's true transformation was beginning. The fight for leadership hadn't been just about eliminating the enemy. It had been a battle to find out who he truly was. He was no longer the man who fought only for power or survival. He had become something more, a leader. The weight of responsibility on his shoulders was greater than any physical struggle. He had won, but he had lost a part of himself in the process. When El Águila stood up with the help of El Chacal, the look between the two said it all. The cartel was, in fact, in their hands now, but with El Toro's body on the ground and the future of the cartel to be rebuilt, El Chacal knew that the price of victory was not just a matter of strength. He had changed. He had become something more than just a hitman. He had become a man capable of leading. But the real climax wasn't just in El Toro's downfall. As he turned to leave the mansion, El Chacal received one last surprise. The door opened, and a new ally entered. An unexpected figure from the past, someone he never imagined he'd see again. The former leader of the cartel, who had been presumed dead. He was alive, and with him, a new threat was about to be revealed. "I knew you'd make it this far, El Chacal," the deep, familiar voice echoed through the room. "But you're not ready for what's coming." The mansion was in ruins, and the silence after the battle seemed to echo in every corner of that place. El Chacal looked at the remaining wreckage, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He had achieved what many thought impossible. Control of the cartel was finally in his hands. But as the first light of dawn began to stream through the broken windows, he knew that although he had won the battle, the war was far from over. The fall of El Toro had been a decisive blow, but the real battle lay in reconstruction. The cartel, torn apart by betrayal and infighting, needed to be reorganized, and that would require more than just force. It would need a new approach, a leadership more strategic than he had ever imagined. But above all, it needed to rebuild broken loyalties, and that would not be easy. El Águila, now stronger than ever, approached. He had recovered quickly from his injury, and the determination in his eyes reflected the change that had taken place between the two. They had started as simple soldiers, fighting for survival, but now they were ready to take command. "Now, the cartel is ours, El Chacal. But we know the challenges don't end here," said El Águila in a grave tone. "The real fight will be to win the trust of the men who remain. They are afraid of what lies ahead, and so are we. I know," El Shakal replied, gazing at the horizon where the city was beginning to awaken. But what matters now is that we're in control. And that means we can change everything. We won't just be another cartel. We'll be something different, something no one will dare challenge. The following days were marked by intense meetings and negotiations. El Chacal and El Aguila were determined to rebuild the cartel, but with a different vision. They knew that power came not only from fear, but from true loyalty. It was time to build strategic alliances, not just forge enemies. The former leader who had surprised El Chacal with his final appearance vanished as quickly as he had appeared. The mystery of his survival still hung over everyone, but what truly mattered was what El Chacal and El Aguila were creating. The cartel was in their hands, and the transformation was only beginning. As El Chacal walked through the corridors of the now silent mansion, he knew the future was within his grasp. It wouldn't be easy, but now he had the power to decide the course he would take. He was ready to build an empire, not just of fear and violence, but of intelligence and strategy. He had left behind the man who once believed that power was conquered only through brute force. The new El Chacal was more than that. He was a leader, a strategist, a man capable of transforming even the most feared cartel in the world. Looking out the window, El Chacal saw the sunrise. The world outside his bubble of violence seemed calm and indifferent, but he knew that, inside his mind, everything had changed. He was no longer the man who only wanted to survive. He was now the man who would choose his own destiny and the destiny of the cartel. And with that certainty, El Chacal took the first step towards a new future, where power would not come only from fear, but from vision. Months had passed since the cartel's takeover. El Chacal and El Aguila had consolidated their power, but the world around them was still changing. The shadows of their past followed them, but the future they were creating was uncertain. A new leader had emerged, but who would be the next to challenge them? The cartel was at peace for now, but alliances could be as fragile as glass, and the power game never ended. The real fight was far from over, but El Chacal knew he was finally in control. Did you enjoy the story of El Chacal and El Aguila? What do you think of their fate in the cartel? Leave your opinion in the comments and share your thoughts on the rise and fall of these complex characters. Will they be able to maintain control, or will the next challenge be even more difficult? Don't forget to follow our channel for more exciting stories like this and share with your friends. The power game never ends, and the real fight is only just beginning.